Yeah, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a new online interview here at Commodity TV. And today I have a special guest from a company which made a really big progress in 2025 and intends to do so in 2026 also. Mark Selby, the CEO of Canada Nickel, is here with me. Mark, good morning to Toronto. Happy New Year and welcome.
Thank you. Yes, Happy New Year to you as well.
Thank you very much. So before we begin, we have to disclose that this interview is being produced, published, and paid for on behalf of Canada Nickel. And I'm also a long-time shareholder of Canada Nickel. So Mark, your company, Canada Nickel, has really taken an amazing turn in recent months. You made several high caliber resource estimates. You have broad support from potential investors. You have backing from the local native communities and support from both the Ontario and the federal government for an accelerated approval of your hopefully future mine. To name just a few points, maybe let's start with the basis of a resource company. So its resources. You have already published resources for 8 several deposits. Can you give us an update on this and maybe the important highlights?
Yeah, so we've got our Crawford Nickel project, which, as you said, we're the only project in Canada that's got both a federal endorsement and a provincial accelerated permitting endorsement. But the even more exciting thing about what we have is not just one great project. We've unlocked an entire nickel district, and so when you top out both the inferred and indicated resources there, you're looking at almost 23 million tons of contained nickel across those 8 deposits. If you've been following our story, I've talked multiple times about Crawford will be our first project, but most of our team believes that we are going to have another 3 or 4 projects that will actually be bigger and better than Crawford in terms of overall value. We're able to see that because we have a geophysical template that's worked very well for these deposits. We have a 98% hit rate, and we've in addition to those 8, we've successfully tested another 10, and we've got another half dozen more that we haven't tested yet. So with the massive move in the nickel market that we've seen in the last month, as Indonesia starts to manage supply, what we have in the Timmins Nickel District is really, the only new Western world supply outside of Indonesia that can deliver large volumes of nickel to the market over the next decade.
Okay, so 8 resources so far. A ninth one to come now in the next couple of weeks or months. Is there further exploration activity planned for 2026?
From an exploration side, it'll be limited. This is the big year in terms of getting Crawford over the line. We'll take a couple of those deposits that we think could be bigger or better than Crawford and continue to advance those along slowly. And then as the year goes on and we get Crawford moving, then we'll turn our attention back to the other deposits. Again, once nickel becomes in favor and the majors start to look for new deposits, again, we're delivering an entire district to the market.
And what's the overall resource at the moment, both indicated and inferred resources?
Yeah, it's about 23 million tons of contained nickel, roughly 10 billion tons at just over 0.2% nickel.
Okay, that looks like that's the biggest or the second biggest or largest nickel resource in the world.
Yeah, it's now the world's largest nickel sulfide resource. The Valley reported the total endowment for Sudbury at about 19 million tons. Now, our recovery rate is lower than Sudbury, so recovered nickel would be lower than that. But again, we've only explored a fraction of the potential that we have in the Timmins district. So we expect that number to grow significantly in the future.
Let's come to the government support. So in November 2025, you announced that the Crawford Nickel project had been officially referred to the Major Projects Office for the Canadian government. And in January 2026, so only a few days ago, it was announced that the province of Ontario had officially designated the Crawford Nickel project as the second project to be advanced under the province's new One Project, One Process initiative. So what exactly does this mean for the future development of Crawford?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great endorsement. And again, we're the only project in Canada that's both got a federal and provincial that type of support from both levels of government. As well, I would encourage people, to look at the press conferences. We were, quite fortunate that Minister Tim Hodgson, who's the Minister of Natural Resources, came up to Timmins to do the press conference there to announce that in November. And then Minister Stephen Lecce, who's the Minister of Mines and Energy in Ontario, and George Peary, who's Minister of Northern Economic Development, was at our provincial announcement last week. The big plus is really on the federal side. We effectively get financing support and permitting support from the Major Projects Office. So, within the federal government, we've talked, about our financing package. There's a whole series of different funding envelopes that are available for critical minerals projects. And so the Major Projects Office, works with us to, basically streamline and make sure that we're at the front of the line with all of those different funding envelopes from the government, which is great. As well, for those of you who saw Mark Carney's speech at Davos this week, we're really focused on building new trade partners, new financing partners, and so the Major Projects Office is going to work to those large sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East and South Asia, where they can bring a whole portfolio of endorsed projects from the government to attract those large sums of capital in, which is great. On the permitting side, we're well down the permitting process with the federal government already. But it will be helpful. There's always little bumps and surprises that come up. So having that strong federal endorsement, will ensure we get through those as smoothly as possible, and we're targeting receipt of that main federal permit by mid-year. On the provincial side, it's primarily focused on permitting. Again, it'll have some benefits in the financing space, but that one project, one process window is very helpful. The way the provincial process works today is you have multiple permits that go to multiple departments, and so there'll be a single person who will help manage that for us. Again, we're well down the path with the province already, but they will basically, help us shepherd those things through, and again, allow us to get our permits, much more quickly than say would have happened 10 years ago.
Okay. Furthermore, in 2025, you announced the results of a study of the economic impact of your Crawford Nickel project. What are the key conclusions from the study?
Yes. So, what's exciting again about the scale of these deposits that we're unlocking? Crawford's the second largest nickel reserve in the world. It would be the Western world's largest nickel sulfide operation. So, just the mine itself will contribute over $70 billion in GDP, to the Canadian economy. Most of that in the province of Ontario. There's 1,000 direct jobs. There's another 3,000 indirect jobs. We're also looking at doing the downstream processing as well in Canada, and that's going to, create a whole other set of additional economic value. And again, when you step back and look at the district and the potential to do Crawford 3 or 4 more times, that's, when we talk about nation building projects, that's what, the Major Projects Office is all about. What we have in Timmins really fits the bill, and that's why we're one of the projects that was chosen.
Okay. Then a question from me as an investor. So earlier in 2025, you both established an exploration company into which you brought several of the original Canada Nickel projects, and a royalty company that holds some NSRs for various projects. Are these companies expected to be listed in the foreseeable future? And could this represent a kind of type of dividend for Canada Nickel shareholders?
Yeah, we'll take them to market when the market's ready for it. Obviously, market for junior mining in metals that are out of favor is still difficult, and we don't want to provide new vehicles for the short sellers out there to take a whack at. But again, that's the key piece here, is that there's multiple ways for us to create value when you have an asset set like what we have here. So, yes, at some point in the future, we will bring those to market, but only at the right time. Right time for our shareholders.
Okay, that makes sense. So in the past, you've entered into various letters of intent with several investors or potential investors. Will any of these funds be due in the coming months, or are they reserved for exclusively for the mine construction?
So the major one is with Samsung SDI. We've got great shareholders in terms of Agnico Eagle, Anglo American, Samsung came in a few years ago, and then in 2025, one of the First Nations groups used $20 million of their own capital to invest in the company, which is a great sign of support and one of the first major investments. The big check that's on the table there is the Samsung SDI investment. They have the option to make that decision on a construction decision, which will be towards the end of this year. And based on our conversations to date, those things are progressing well, and we expect them to exercise their option when that time comes.
Okay, so you already mentioned the nickel price or the nickel market. So the price of nickel has recently regained some ground. What do you expect to see in terms of future developments here?
Yeah, so the what happened at the end of the year and through the latter part is what I had actually expected at this time early last year. But it's good that the Indonesians have finally woken up, to the power that they have in their own hands. They control over 2/3 of nickel supply. That's they're an OPEC of one country, and they've got much more market share than OPEC did at its peak of the oil market. So they made a series of announcements through the second half of the year, really signaling to the market, we're going to get serious about managing supply. We're going to get serious about managing supply. And then they made the announcement, in late December, early January that, they are going to manage ore supply. So there's effectively no growth year over year. And so that caused nickel prices to go up by more than $4,000 a ton in a very short span of time. I think we're less than 15% away from what the number we used in our feasibility study, and we expect nickel prices to get there over the next year. This first leg up it was really, okay, Indonesia's serious about managing the market. I think we'll see another leg up in the nickel price up to the $20,000 to $22,000 range once we start to see the data out of Indonesia that, yes, indeed, that managing of ore supply, either it's coming through reported statistics or you're seeing it in the price of ore and nickel pig iron and that whole supply chain within Indonesia. The good thing is over the past 2 weeks, we've seen stainless steel prices in China and Indonesia move up significantly. We've seen nickel pig iron prices move up significantly. We're seeing ore prices within Indonesia just in the past week start to move up significantly. So, I think you'll see more of that over the next 2 months. And again, you'll see nickel prices respond accordingly. So it's going to be a great year for us in terms of and the nickel market, and a great year going forward. People viewed Indonesia as this unlimited amount of nickel, but the reality was they were already importing substantial amounts of ore from the Philippines to fill up the plants that had already been built. And the key piece there is ore grades in Indonesia are really dropping. They've dropped almost 15% over the last 3 years alone. And that trend, because laterite deposits are easy to high grade because they're shallow at surface over large lateral expanses. So you're going to see that grade decline continue. So, in terms of managing nickel supply, the thesis has always been the world will need a bunch of more nickel from somewhere other than Indonesia. And I think that, that time is finally coming here.
Last question. What can investors expect from Canada Nickel in 2026? What would you say will be the most important milestones or catalysts?
Yeah, so at both the federal announcement and provincial announcement, we said we're targeting to start a construction, by the end of this year. So what you'll see is a whole series of financing milestones. As we complete the funding package, we're looking to get visibility on what that funding package is going to be by mid-year. You will lock it down by the third quarter, be in a position to break ground from a financing side by the end of the fourth quarter. And then on the permitting side, we expect that main federal permit by mid-year. You'll see a series of permitting milestones. And then on the project itself, you don't flip a switch, all of a sudden wake up, flip a switch and start a $2 billion project. So you'll see a number of project development milestones, as the year goes on.
Okay, Mike. Thank you very much for this insight into the company and the current status. We keep all fingers crossed for the plans for this year. And I would say we should do an update soon.
Yes, sounds good. There's going to be lots happening.
Thanks. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, that was Mark Selby from Canada Nickel. You heard it. The company is in really good shape. A lot of support from First Nations, investors, governments, and so on. And the company is really delivering. And by the way, Canada Nickel is also part of the Swiss Resource Capital Battery Metals report, which you could download for free at rohstoff-reports.com. Just have a look, and I believe we also have this here in the video. Yeah, I would say check out Canada Nickel, and bye-bye from Switzerland.